Hello everybody and welcome to our first lesson in a series on normative ethics. Now this is going to be providing a basic introduction to the subject of normative ethics and the sort of philosophical foundations for that subject. And it's going to be fundamentally concerned with taking an overview of what normative ethics fundamentally is and providing some of the key foundations as well as the key illustrative uses for why normative ethics is so important and why it is arguably the most studied and talked about of the various different branches of moral philosophy. So, like I said, this is our first lesson in a series on this subject, and what we're going to do is provide a basic overview of the subject as well as provide a basic introduction to some of the foundational principles. So, of course, with all that being said, the first question that we're going to ask is simply the easiest question, which is what actually is normative ethics? Well, it's a branch of philosophical ethics. It's a branch of moral philosophy. So we're talking about morality. We're talking about right action, wrong action. We're talking about good versus bad actions and decisions. And it is concerned with the criteria for what is considered to be a morally correct, justifiable action and what is considered to be morally wrong or immoral or something of that kind of nature or unethical. And so this is the most important part of normative ethics, the idea of concerning ourselves with criteria for what is considered to be morally correct and morally wrong. It involves the formulation of moral rules that have implications for human actions. It has implications that concerns itself with institutions, how businesses operate in certain circumstances, how governments operate, how international organizations operate, as well as the basic foundations for understanding a moral way of life. And generally speaking, what normative ethics seeks to do and seeks to establish is a number of standards and norms for moral conduct. Normative ethics therefore aims to determine the actions, which actions are right and which actions are wrong, and it does so by establishing moral principles or rules. Again, looking at it from the perspective of a guideline, looking at the guidelines for human behavior and for human decision making. So what are moral judgments, therefore? What does this actually involve us actually thinking about? Well, it involves making conclusions. It involves making decisions or coming to conclusions about the moral worth of actions, about the moral worth of intentions, and about the moral worth of characteristics, of character traits. And these are obviously going to be judged from a normative ethical perspective on the basic moral principles that we find to be the foundations of whichever normative theory we are going to be advocating for. And there are a variety of different normative ethical theories. There are a variety of different categories of normative ethical theories that we will get onto, of course, throughout this series of lessons. And so fundamentally, when we talk about this and when we talk about moral judgments, we're looking at it through the lens of that particular normative ethical framework. We are seeking to justify certain actions and principles and whether or not they should be considered morally right or morally wrong. And in order to do so, we have to employ a certain degree of rationality. We have to provide rational philosophical arguments and explanations to our consideration, to our ways of coming to conclusions about certain moral actions. And without getting ahead of ourselves too much, depending on the type of and the normative ethical theory that we're concerning about, will actually influence the extent to which rationality and autonomy and the idea of individual rationality of people is actually influential in the determination of those moral principles. So, for example, Immanuel Kant and sort of deontological theories of ethics tend to present a certain degree of rationality into moral decision making. So with all this being said, the thing that I want to essentially finish this lesson on and to sort of formulate this video on is this idea of the different major categories of normative ethical theories. So fundamentally, normative ethical theory is a system or a standard by which you can present a moral conundrum, you can present a moral question, and according to that ethical theory, it will tell you whether or not the action that you decide to do is morally correct or morally incorrect. That's essentially how you could understand it. You could almost view normative ethics as a sort of type of a type of function machine where you put in your inputs and it comes out with which output is morally correct or incorrect. So, for example, depending on the normative ethical theory, we could, for example, take the issue of euthanasia as a sort of moral ethical conundrum, or abortion rights, and we can put that into a normative ethical theory. We could say, well, what would a deontological presentation be of that? What would a consequentialist theory be on that? And then from that, depending on which normative ethical theory we are applying it to, we can basically get an answer as to what ought to be done in that particular circumstance. Hence why we're talking about normativity. We're talking about what ought to be done. We're making prescriptions rather than descriptions. And it is these two categories that are very interesting, the sort of consequentialist on the one hand versus the deontological on the other. Fundamentally, consequentialism is a theory of the rightness or wrongness of an action, which depends on the consequences. I've written here depends solely on the consequences. Sometimes this is the case. Sometimes you will have like very pure consequentialist theories, like a sort of pure version of utilitarianism, for example. And this would almost entirely and exclusively concern itself with the concept of the consequences of an action, the extent to which the consequences of an action is morally right or wrong. But there are obviously some interconnections between the two. Deontological theorists and deontological ethics is often associated with people like Immanuel Kant and focuses on the inherent morality of actions rather than their consequences. So according to a basic classical utilitarian or a basic classical quite pure consequentialist, an action is either moral or immoral depending on the outcome, depending on what that action actually leads to. Whereas, according to a deontologist, there are certain basic principles from which, regardless of what the consequences of that action was, is actually fundamentally immoral or fundamentally moral. There's a certain amount of concreteness about the standards of which we are talking about ethical theories, something that doesn't exist necessarily in consequentialist theories. So the major shift that we can essentially get to from here is that when we think about normative ethics and we have a very good foundational framework of what normative ethics is, we can then go out into the real world and start thinking about applying this to applied ethics. Normative ethics is applied to a variety of different fields. You could look at how it is applied to law, how it is applied to medicine and medical ethics, how it is applied to business, how it is applied to public policy. It provides a framework for addressing ethical dilemmas and for addressing and for guiding moral decision-making in what is considered to be a variety of different contexts. And it is for this reason that it plays a very crucial role in guiding human conduct by providing rational and therefore systemic approaches and systematic approaches in terms of the ability to have a standard of ethics that is able to essentially tackle any moral conundrum that is thrown at it, and this will obviously lead to the evaluation of actions by establishing moral norms. By examining the consequences, or by examining duties, or by examining virtues. Another normative ethical theory is, of course, virtue ethics, which we will get to as well in the future. We can obviously come to conclusions about how individuals and societies ought to navigate the moral complexities of life. So that fundamentally wraps up this basic introduction video. There's a few citations and further reading here in terms of the ways in which philosophy, moral philosophy, and specifically normative ethics is actually approached. for the most part, the short introduction to ethics is very, very good. But also, I should note for the most part that normative ethics is not necessarily a topic that has its own textbook per se. It normally is an ethics textbook, which obviously includes some normative questions as well as a number of meta-ethical conundrums and meta-ethics, and then applied ethics as well. So there are a variety of different places and sources that you can actually derive these different principles from. In addition to this, there's also the fact that we're going to be talking about actual philosophers. We're going to be talking about Kant, we're going to be talking about Bentham, we're going to be talking about Mill, and we're going to be talking about Aristotle. And so you could go and find writings and find texts and find works on those individual philosophers and see how they approach ethics as well from that perspective. And that would also provide a very useful framework and foundation of your understanding for moral philosophy.